All right, good evening and welcome to our program, Advocating for Your Child Like an Expert. I'm Lorraine Moffa, Programming Coordinator for Loudoun County Public Library and your host today. Please feel free to share any comments or questions you have by using the chat feature, and I'll be happy to relay them to our presenter. And it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter. Lorraine Hightower is a certified dyslexia and special education advocate who works with families to support children of all ages. Through her personal outreach, she continues to inform and influence local education leaders, legislators, and community members on best practices for children with specific learning disabilities. She has been instrumental in affecting local policy and state legislation to improve the educational experience for special education students. Lorraine's advocacy and consulting business is based out of Lansdowne, Virginia, and she specializes in advocating for parents whose children have dyslexia. Welcome back, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. That is such a nice, warm welcome on a rainy day, and it's my pleasure to be back with your community. And tonight I am so excited to be sharing the framework that I use when I'm working with families to help them advocate for their child who has disabilities. So if you don't have a paper or a pen and your favorite beverage nearby, I would encourage you to grab that. And if we have questions at the end of the presentation, Lorraine, I'll be happy to address them if time allows. And first of all, I just want to thank your audience for joining us this evening. I know there's a lot of other options for parents after work and after school, but part of my team and my mission this year is to do all that we can to ensure that parents who have students with disabilities are knowledgeable so that they can be empowered and take action more effectively in advocating for their kids. We are in our third year of a non-traditional school year, and we know parents have found it very challenging. So we're excited you're here, and we're excited to share the framework that I believe, once parents understand it, can make a meaningful difference. As Lorraine said, I have had the opportunity over the last 11 years to wear a lot of different hats and serve in a lot of different roles. Probably the role that I'm most proud of is as the parent of a student who does have dyslexia, dysgraphia, as well as ADHD. So my son, we knew that he had challenges with reading and writing and spelling when he was in first and second grade, but my efforts as a parent to have him found eligible for special education services was certainly not easy. And I know many in your audience probably can identify that with that. And so through the process of getting my son evaluated, both in school as well as privately, and kind of jumping through all the hoops and hurdles that I had to do, again, over 11 years ago in advocating for a student with dyslexia, I was able to acquire specialized knowledge and training. And I like to say I really took my pain as a parent who struggled to get my son what he needed into my passion as a certified dyslexia advocate. And so, as I said tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework that I use because I do work for kids who have dyslexia. We'll use that as an example, but it certainly pertains to all other disabilities as well. And again, I love this slide because it talks about empowering, which is making stronger or more confident, especially in controlling their life and claiming their rights. And for us, in terms of advocates, this is what we aspire to do for the families that we serve and what I am aspiring to do for all of you tonight. I'm hoping that you will leave this presentation with a couple of knowledge points that maybe you didn't have before, or a couple of nuggets on how you can take different steps and move the needle a little farther for your child who most likely has a disability if you're here, and that can, result in a more effective education plan. So let's get started and talk about what I'm going to address. We are going to talk a little bit about mindset tonight, because I do believe that when parents are advocating effectively for their kids, they do need to make a couple of little mindset shifts going into that. And then, as I said, I'm going to share the framework that I use every day and every week to transform the lives of kids with dyslexia. So I do have to start though, and I think it gives some context to our discussion, to say that, what got you here to this presentation is important to acknowledge, because as I was sharing, we are in our third year of a non-traditional school year. while all kids are struggling, kids who have disabilities are struggling even more. And I know parents who are trying to meet the needs of these kids are also finding it exceptionally difficult. And I just want to highlight some of the challenges that parents have shared with me. And that is, number one, that they don't believe their child has an appropriate educational plan, or special education students, often it's referred to as an individualized education program or an IEP. Parents tell us they don't understand the data. They are unclear on what their child needs. They feel school teams are unclear on what their child needs. They are relying and trusting that the school is going to know what is best for their child. And too often as parents, we simply hope that things are just going to kind of work themselves out. And many families, when they first reach out to us, say, you know, we've been waiting for a while for someone at the school to take action. We've been talking to them about our concerns with our child and certain academic or maybe other functional or social concerns, and we're just waiting for someone to call us or to schedule a meeting. And so, of course, I do not believe that that approach is effective and is not going to get you as a parent to the goal that I believe you're ultimately trying to achieve for your child, which is to have an effective education plan in place. We will talk a little bit more throughout the presentation how, you know, parents have to have knowledge of the testing and need to figure out how are they going to interpret all of the data that is available so that they can advocate for their child's unique needs. And we're going to talk a little bit about working collaboratively with school teams and the importance of showing progress towards a child's goals. And I think that, you know, all of these, in my mind, are successful components of a strong parent advocate. So it's a lot, and parents always say to me, well, how do you suggest I do that? And I always say, well, you need clear guidance from somebody that you can trust. So again, thank you for joining us. And I think that parents need to learn how to do advocacy, is what I'm going to say. And we do provide this framework. We educate parents on it. I'm going to take you through it in just a minute. And this is a framework that gets results, gets advocacy results, which result in a meaningful difference for kids. And then when parents have a framework and they know how to use it, that gives them more of, I will say, the confidence that they need to come across more knowledgeably and convince school teams that what they're asking for is not unreasonable. I also believe that advocacy should not be a secret. So parents say to me, well, you know, I'm surprised you're sharing all of this information so publicly. But again, we know parents and kids are still in pain, that too often decisions are being made at school eligibility meetings or IEP meetings or just in hallways and conversations that are not resulting in the right outcome for students. So we want to share everything that we can and encourage you again to write down any questions that you have as we move through this process. So the framework that I use each and every day does involve 3 key knowledge points and the creation of an action plan for each kid that I advocate for. And this is really based on everything that I've learned over the last 11 years. We put it in this very user-friendly framework so that we can kind of fast track parents on what we believe they need to know when they're advocating on their own. And the first key knowledge point that I'd like to talk a little bit about is understanding the child's disability. And as I said, tonight I'm going to be talking using the example of a child who has dyslexia, because that is the population that I serve. But it really, these knowledge points and this action plan could apply to any child with a different disability. But understanding the disability is really key. And we're going to dive into this a little bit deeper as to how, if a parent doesn't understand the child's disability, that could be very problematic when working with the school team and trying to make informed decisions. Here are some of the I'm going to call them myths that often happen when parents don't understand a child's disability. And again, for our purposes, let's think about a child who has dyslexia, which is a language processing disorder that affects the child's ability to read and spell. So too often parents will, you know, say, well, I know my child has dyslexia, but they may not really understand what that means. So if they hear at a school meeting or an eligibility meeting, or maybe even at a teacher conference, well, yes, they might have dyslexia, but don't worry, I know other people who have that, they'll grow out of it, or they're not really that far behind, they're still super young. And I think that, if we give it a little bit more time, they're going to catch up and kind of close that gap on their own. Or sometimes they will say, your child seems a little bit tired or distracted, or they have reading after lunch, so maybe that's why they're not making progress. Or unfortunately, these days we're hearing a lot of conversation around, well, the pandemic is making it very hard for all kids to make progress. And these really are just myths. These are not facts. And if a parent was well informed about the nuances of dyslexia, they would know that with a neurological language processing disability, kids don't grow out of it, right? It takes a specialized intervention to close that gap. So if parents do not really have a full understanding of the child's disability, how can they be expected, as we say, to kind of separate out facts from myths? And understanding the disability is really important. And this leads me to kind of the first mindset shift that I want to encourage parents to make when they're advocating for their child. And that is to not rely on others to determine what is best for your child, but to decide that as your child's parent, who probably knows the child better than anyone else, you're going to rely on yourself to determine what is best for your child. And we're going to talk about how you might do that. But to me, this is really a big part of deciding that you're going to kind of take your power back as a parent and use it in making meaningful decisions for your child. And I also want to share an example of the consequences of what this can look like when parents are kind of still relying on school teams to make all of those decisions. So not too long ago, I was working with a family. They told me they had a young boy who had dyslexia. They knew he had dyslexia. I glanced at the IEP. It looked like the school team had proposed some decoding strategies and goals, some encoding or spelling goals. They were going to try to help the child, close the gap on his spelling. They were even going to build up his reading fluency. And yet when I went to the IEP meetings and I started asking more specific questions about this child's services, all the school team was really talking about was how the child had school refusal and how he was hiding under the desk and how he was becoming a big behavior problem in the classroom. And so I started asking more targeted questions about the school team's knowledge of dyslexia and what is the intervention that you're using and how are you progress monitoring that. And what I found is that none of this was really happening with fidelity. So the child was obviously frustrated. He wasn't making meaningful progress, and yet the school team was kind of pushing him through the intervention. And so his behavior really wasn't the issue. It was more of a symptom of the issue, which was his needs, his unique needs as it pertained to dyslexia, the language processing piece, were not being addressed. And so this child started having symptoms of behavior problems. And once we did work with the IEP team to get appropriate intervention and services delivered with fidelity in place, almost all of that behavior, I'm going to say all of that behavior, totally went away. In fact, about, I would say 6 to 8 months later, when I met with the IEP team again, they actually removed this young man's behavior goals because he was finally making progress and learning how to read and spell, and they could see that behavior really wasn't the issue at all. So a parent, unless they truly understood what is an appropriate intervention for kids with dyslexia, what does it look like to be implemented with fidelity, they would be at a big disadvantage in advocating for that young man on their own. So the second key knowledge point that I believe parents do need to become comfortable with is gathering and interpreting information. In my world, I believe it is critical for parents to have all available information that speaks to what their child can and cannot do. For kids who have dyslexia, this often means that parents will need to ask for additional data beyond, some of the standardized benchmarks and assessments that are done as part of the regular school year. They might need to request very specific assessments on the child's ability to decode or to spell. They might want to know, can my child read fluently? How many correct words per minute do they have? And, can they do? And do you have any assessments on that? Or they might want to know, can my child, perform these skills if it's a different disability in all of the same settings? So data is going to be critically important in knowing what your child can and cannot do, and also having an ability to compare it to the child's same age and same grade level peers. And when I'm talking about data, I'm talking about formal data and informal data, which includes parent data. You might have teachers who work with the child in other classes that aren't coming to the eligibility meetings or the IEP meetings that you can get input from. If your child is working with outside practitioners or therapists, they might be able to provide some meaningful data on the child's abilities or how the disability is impacting them. But it is really critical. And I know parents often go to these meetings and hear some of this information discussed, but I think if you can make the request and get as much data that speaks to your child's present levels of performance in advance, and if you need help interpreting that, you can ask, what are these scores actually saying about my child, and do all of that before the school meeting. You will be definitely 10 steps ahead in your advocacy efforts because you will be so much more informed. So knowing how to gather the data and use the data is really one of the foundational steps of advocacy. And I have data drives decisions on the slide because that is the fact. When I go to eligibility meetings or I go to IEP meetings for a child, it all starts with looking at all the data that we have. And too often what I see with parents sometimes, again, I'm there to support the parents, but prior to working with me, they'll say, well, I went in and I asked for these things, or, I just told them how frustrating this is for my child. And they're really advocating from a place of emotion more than using the data to help drive their request and ultimately the decisions of the team. So what we want you to take away from this slide is that after you've worked out what is my child's disability and you've gotten all the data that you need to understand how it's impacting your child, the school team should be using that data to create goals that are appropriate for your child's abilities and disabilities, right? What can't they do? And then from those goals, that's going to determine what type of specially designed instruction your child needs, what type of accommodations or any additional related services does your child need. So truly it all begins with an evaluation. And then it begins with progress monitoring data. And so I really want to make sure that parents understand just how important data is. And when we talk about data, there's another mindset shift that I'm going to encourage you as a parent to make. And that is, too many parents feel like I'm not the educational expert. I'm going to count on the school to gather and get all of the data that they think they need to make decisions for my child. I want you as a parent to realize that under the regulations, which we'll talk about in a moment, you are considered a critical required member of your child's team. So you have the right to say, I believe my child is having challenges with reading comprehension. And what data do we have that shows, what can my child do and what can't they do? And if we don't have that data, I'm asking for it because I believe we need it as we work together, parent and school team, to make appropriate decisions. And once you have made the shift, I'm going to say that you are going to feel empowered to ask for certain data about your child's needs and abilities. I think that you will see that you don't have to take no for an answer anymore. And what I mean by that, and I tell parents all the time, is no really, in my mind, when I hear no from a school team, I interpret that to mean not now. Because when a school team often says no, they're saying that because we don't have the data, which, in front of us that speaks to your parental request. So I'll give you an example of, again, child with dyslexia. If there's a multi-year reading gap that the parent believes exists for the child, but the child has not gone through an evaluation, has not been found eligible for special education services, then, the school team, and they have a right to say this, is going to be like, well, we're not going to provide any kind of special reading. Your child's getting reading in the classroom. We're teaching reading to all kids. But again, how do we change that decision? We request the evaluation. We get the specific data that's going to show if there is a multi-year gap in those skills, so that at that point, if the child meets the criteria, the school's going to agree to provide it. So the third key knowledge point in our framework towards working towards a successful plan really is the creation of the educational plan. And when we're talking about kids with disabilities, we are talking about an individualized education program, or an IEP, which falls under the regulation of IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think are the three components of a successful education plan. So, of course, when you have an IEP for a child, what makes it appropriate, effective, and in my mind, kind of, get that gold star is that the goals are all based on the child's present levels of performance. So they're not just goals that the team thought would be a good idea or the parent asked for them and so we put them in there. They're data informed. We actually have looked at all available data and we've determined, yes, this child has these needs. And so we've got a baseline for them. We know where they're starting from. We've written a goal. We know what we want them to accomplish in the lifetime of that IEP, which is typically 1 calendar school year. And that is the key first part of a successful education plan. We also want to make sure that the services and accommodations that are included in the plan are appropriate based on the student's needs and the student's disability. And this is something that I do see often for children with dyslexia. They won't, while they might have great goals, the services may or may not be appropriate for a child who has a diagnosed and often severe language processing disorder. So you do want to make sure that whatever the team is offering is appropriate. And again, when I'm looking to work with school teams and they're talking about services, I'm asking, well, who's going to deliver that service? What is the curriculum that you're going to be following? What is the scope and sequence of that curriculum? Because when we're talking about kids who have dyslexia, we are really looking for a multi-sensory, structured, explicit, systematic approach, which is teaching language in a structured literacy format. And so if we don't hear that, I'm going to be concerned. And the third component of a successful educational plan or program, as the regulation calls it, is making sure that we know how we're going to be progress monitoring the student over the course of the year that the IEP is in place. So, do the goals actually speak to how we're going to progress monitor this? And do we believe those are appropriate ways to progress monitor? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the goals and the services are closing the child's achievement gap in the defined areas of need. So I also, when we're talking about education plans, I have to kind of debunk a couple of the common myths that I hear quite frequently from parents when they first start working with us. And, some of them are listed here, but too often, parents think that only the school team can suggest goals and services for their child. So we want you to know that is not true. Parents can certainly advocate for and ask for certain goals. Again, we want you to have the data to back it up, but you certainly can ask for that, and to know that educators may or may not. And again, I'm very pro teacher and pro school, but oftentimes we don't understand, maybe they don't know what's available. So they might be making a recommendation that isn't appropriate because they don't know that another recommendation or program exists, or maybe they don't know that it's not appropriate to use a certain methodology of instruction for a child with dyslexia. And too often parents tell me, well, they told me I see this a lot at the middle school and high school level. They'll say, well, they told me that this is what they do for all of the kids in middle school who have dyslexia. Well, that may or may not be appropriate for your child. And, unfortunately, we do hear from parents these days when school teams are we're all dealing with a lot. They'll say, I tried, I asked, and nobody really listened to me. And again, when we were talking about the knowledge points, having the data to back up what you're saying can make a significant difference in how well parents are listened to. So I want to tell you, from my own experience as an advocate, as well as in supporting parents behind the scenes, knowledge really is power. And that's why, we like to put it in this little diagram for you. But if you as a parent have a good understanding of the disability, have the data to back up your request, we have seen it with our own eyes, and I want to encourage you to believe that you can get a different outcome for your child. In fact, I believe that once parents have a good grasp and they know how to do this on a regular basis, they truly will see what I call educational transformation start to take place for their child. And what do I mean by educational transformation? That's really that closing of that achievement gap that exists. And you have a child who's now actually acquiring the skills that they need to catch up to their same age and same grade level peers, which is obviously what we all want when we have a child who has a disability. We want them to close that gap to the best of their ability and be able to show what they know. So again, another mindset shift that I want to encourage you to make and want to emphasize in this presentation is, too often parents are like, well, I don't have a master's in education. I'm kind of unqualified to take on, the educational diagnostician or the teacher. But again, parents are experts in their own children. And we saw this more during the distance learning of the pandemic than ever before. Parents actually had direct access 24 hours a day. They saw their children in the classroom. They could see what they could do and they could see what they couldn't do. And they became extremely knowledgeable about what their child needed or maybe didn't need anymore. So I want to encourage you as a parent who I know is an expert in your child to decide, I can do this. I have the desire and the dedication to advocate for my child, and I'm going to use a framework like this to get my child what I know they need. So now that you are familiar with the 3 key knowledge points, I want to talk a little bit about the actual action plan that I use for each of the kids that I support. This is the tool that I use, again, whether I do it for parents, I use this as my framework, or when I teach parents, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, we teach parents through a group advocacy coaching program, we use this same framework because we have seen time and time again that it actually gets results. And we had one parent this past fall say, you know what, I'm not calling it an action plan. It's really more of an empowerment plan, which of course we love because we think of it that way as well. So the first step in creating your action plan for your child is really listing out all of your child's personal signs of their disability. And while I'm talking a lot about dyslexia, this is possible really to do for any disability. But when we're talking about dyslexia, this is where a parent would list out, my child is having challenges in reading and spelling. Obviously reading fluently is difficult for them, but I'm going to encourage you to think even deeper than that and think about across that child's entire day, across the curriculum, how is their disability impacting them? So again, a couple of examples for a child with dyslexia, they might have a very difficult time in band class, reading sheet music, or they might have a difficult time if they're older learning the driver's ed curriculum because they may not be able to understand all of the language. Often kids with dyslexia have challenges with left and right directionality, or maybe they're in a foreign language class and we know that they have a language processing disorder if they have dyslexia, so they haven't even mastered English, and now we're asking them to learn the language of Spanish as well. So these would be concerns or the symptoms and the examples that I would use to talk about how my child's disability was impacting them in that example for a student with dyslexia across the curriculum. So, I like to also share when I do these presentations that it's critically important that parents take the time to do this and be able to speak about the impact that the child's disability is having on them, because at the very beginning of the special education process, when you're trying to get a child found eligible for services or accommodations or maybe both, school teams are going to want to know what is the adverse impact that the child's disability is having on them, because having a diagnosis is not enough to get an IEP in place for a student who has disabilities, and it does not ensure eligibility. And I find, unfortunately, too often parents think, oh, I got this evaluation, or my pediatrician gave me this letter, and now I'm going to go and get my child found eligible. And you will find, if you haven't already had that unfortunate experience, and I hope since you're here you can avoid it, when you get to the eligibility table, school teams are going to want to know, not just does your child have a disability or do you suspect a disability that you're asking them to evaluate for, but what are you seeing in terms of adverse impact of the disability across the academic, functional, and social emotional setting as it pertains to your entire, as they call it, whole child. So next, parents are going to need to determine, do we have all of the data or the information we need to make whatever decision you're making as part of the special education process. So we just talked a little bit about evaluations and eligibility. That's why school teams conduct an evaluation. So before an eligibility decision can be made for a child who's suspected of having a disability, they are required to do a comprehensive evaluation. And from that evaluation, there's all kinds of data. There's data on the child's, psychological and cognitive abilities, thinking abilities. There's data on all across all academic settings. You might have an evaluation on speech language skills, occupational therapy. You might, if it's a child who has different disabilities, you might have hearing or vision evaluations done. So all of that will be necessary to have at the eligibility table, depending upon, what we're considering the child needs services for. So data acquisition and review is going to be very important. And if parents feel like they don't have all the data that they need, again, from this presentation, we want you to feel empowered to ask for it. As a parent, you will want to look prior to going to the school and saying, I believe my child has a disability, or I know my child has a disability. You're going to want to, take a quick stock of what you have. I also want you to think about the date of that data. While parent input is always relevant, school teams like to look for private tests, or let's just say any type of assessment data from the last 3 years. So if your data, let's say your child was evaluated in first grade and now they're in fifth grade, and you believe, they still have these gaps in certain areas, again, using our example child who has dyslexia, and now you have, additional concerns about their reading or their writing or their spelling, the school team is really not going to give a whole lot of credit to a evaluation that was done that long ago. So 3 years is kind of the standard on what is acceptable in terms of relevant data. And then as we say, if you don't have it, you can certainly ask for it, and you can ask the school team to do additional evaluations and anything that you feel should be looked at further for your child. Then we want you as parents to really, roll up your sleeves and do your best to interpret the data and what it is telling you. Just about every school district that I work in offers the opportunity to parents, when they evaluate a child, to have what's called an interpretive conference with the parent, where they will actually take the time to explain the evaluation that they did, the findings of that evaluation. They'll explain standard scores. They will talk percentages if you want them to. So you can start to draw conclusions on, is this a problem for my child? Is this not a problem for my child? And what I also believe is unfortunate if parents don't take advantage of these opportunities to ask questions beforehand. Things move very quickly when teams get together for eligibility and IEP meetings, and they don't take the time to comb through the evaluations and the assessment data like parents might want them to. So the more you can do on the front end, the more you can do before the eligibility meeting or the IEP meeting, the better off you're going to be in terms of getting the outcome that you want. So once you've drawn some conclusions from your child's data, the next part of creating the action plan is to start to list, you've determined that how the disability is impacting them. You either have the data to show that impact, or you're going to get the data to show that impact. And then you need to start thinking about, now that we know what my child needs, what kind of goals and services and accommodations should the school team be putting in place based upon everything that I'm seeing as a parent? And again, we're not saying that you're going to come with all of your pre-printed goals and hand that to the school team, but you should definitely have a bullet list, an outline of areas of need, and maybe, think about, well, for a child with dyslexia, almost always they're going to need phonemic awareness goals. They're going to need decoding or word attack goals. They're going to need a spelling goal. They're going to need a reading fluency goal, and there could be others. It might impact written expression. So whatever the disability category is, once you identify what are your child's needs or deficits, then you can start to think about, well, what should the goals look like? What do I believe my child should be able to do? And what type of services, if I have any thoughts as a parent, or maybe I have a private evaluation and there's some recommendations in there on what services in school should look like. We want parents to start to think about that, and also accommodations. You know, we had a lot of parents who have children with dyslexia during distance learning tell us that was a bit of a nightmare for them because their children are not spelling on grade level, and yet in distance learning they were being asked to type and to communicate into the chat with their teacher. So that was extremely problematic, especially for very young children. They really couldn't access their education, their classroom. They couldn't communicate with the teacher because they didn't know how to type or spell in the chat. So that's just an example of an accommodation that needed to be made during distance learning for a child who has severe dyslexia. They can't use the chat. They need to be accommodated differently so that they can access their education and communicate with their teacher. And the biggest thing to remember when you're determining goals and services for your child is that these need to be personalized. Often I will say, you know, I in the IEP does stand for individualized. And I think sometimes school teams forget this, parents often forget this, but special education is really not one size fits all. It truly is supposed to be based on the child's needs and how we're hoping to help them close their personal achievement gaps. And finally, as part of that action plan, we want to make sure that there's an effective progress monitoring measure in place. So every goal should say, how is the goal going to be progress monitored? And then above and beyond the goals and the progress monitoring, you know, there's other district-wide assessments that can be done and requested at certain intervals throughout the year. Again, using our example child who might have dyslexia, if there's a decoding goal in place for the child, well, in addition to maybe weekly or bi-monthly progress reports towards that goal, there's other assessments like a core phonics survey that can be given 3 times a year that can inform, is a child closing the gap? Are they learning how to decode all of the main syllable types? So that's something that's important to talk about with the school team. How are we going to progress monitor my child's performance in each of these areas? And as parents, we really want to make sure that you know you can ask for this information. While school teams are required to report on the progress of students who have disabilities as frequently as they report on the progress of general education students, so that if you think about report cards coming out 4 times a year, they are required to provide IEP progress reports, a minimum of 4 times a year. That doesn't really mean that you can't ask for progress monitoring data more frequently. And I often encourage parents to do so. At a minimum, absolute minimum, you should be getting quarterly progress reports. But in some cases, if there's a multi-year gap, or we're trying a new intervention, or you know, maybe it's a group setting and not an individualized setting, and we're kind of wondering how the student's going to do, parents can ask for more frequent progress monitoring measures. And I also believe it's important to share that what you're really looking for when you're looking for progress monitoring, you're looking for trends. You're looking for upward trends that are closing this child's gap, right? So if you're thinking about a fluency goal for a student who has dyslexia, you're looking to see that student improve their ability to read so many correct words per minute. You're looking to see that number go up every single week when they're doing a fluency probe. If it's up and down, well, that trend data is telling you the student is too inconsistent. And maybe the intervention's not appropriate. Maybe the setting's not appropriate. Maybe the teacher needs more training. But you're really looking for upward trend data as you're considering progress towards each of the child's goals. And I do want to say that once you have that educational, you know, action plan in place as you go to your meetings, it really, you know, it can change everything. And I had a parent not too long ago who was going, she had a high school student. She had been going to IEP meetings for years. And she reached out to us because she said it's the most stressful thing she does. She never knows what to ask for. She doesn't understand how decisions are made. Her child obviously was not making progress. And so we helped her put a advocacy action plan in place for her child. And she called me after that meeting and said it was the most enjoyable IEP meeting that she had ever gone to, because not only did she know right out of the gate what her child needed, she had the data to back it up, and she knew what additional data she was going to ask for, and she was a very knowledgeable, empowered parent, and this all resulted in different services for her high school student, as well as a few additional accommodations and assistive technology tools that he had not had in place before. So again, I just want you to know that even in this time of a non-traditional school year, parents absolutely can get results by operating a little bit differently in their advocacy efforts. So I just want to quickly recap, because I know this is a lot, and I hope that if parents are here and they have questions, you're jotting them down. But the framework that we teach and the framework that I use does rely on these 3 knowledge points: understanding the child's disability, the adverse impact of that disability, so that you can really dive in and figure out what are your child's needs. Then we talk about gathering the data and the information you need to really back up your parental request as you're speaking about the child's needs. And then creating the plan, that's when you start to work with the school team on, okay, now that we know what my child needs and we have this data that shows that they need this, what are the goals we're going to put in place? What types of services can you propose at this point in time to close our child's gap? And what accommodations do they need? Definitely for children who have a multi-year gap of their ability to read or to spell and write, you know, they need assistive technology. They should have a lot of assistive technology accommodations while they're being remediated on their reading and spelling, so that they can show what they know in the general education, you know, classroom. And we talked also about the importance of progress monitoring, because this is not a one and done. When we're advocating for a student who has an IEP, we should be going to that annual IEP meeting, yes, but progress monitoring throughout the year. And I also want to say that if the progress monitoring data that you're looking at is not encouraging, parents have the right to request an IEP meeting at any point in the school year. You do not need to wait until the annual IEP meeting. You can simply say, I have these concerns. And as from my lens, I would love it if you use some data to back up your concerns when you're asking to reconvene the IEP team. And the school, you know, from all of my experience, they'll come back together, they'll have that conversation. So we want you to know that that's an option for you as well. And I know this definitely sounds like a lot, but you know, I always tell parents it's really a marathon and it's not a sprint. Because if we have a child, let's say hypothetically, found eligible for services in 1st grade, parents are going to be advocating for that child a minimum of once a year throughout that child's entire education, which could be 11 years, right? And if you have a child whose disabilities are severe enough that they're going to get special education services and support beyond the age of 18, you might be advocating even longer. So, you know, again, my goal tonight is to share the framework that I believe parents should become comfortable using so that they can do this year after year after year, and it doesn't have to be such a hardship for them, and they have some structure to kind of help them with their advocacy efforts. So, you know, of course, parents say to me, wow, this sounds impossible. And I want to acknowledge again that I know it sounds like a lot, but what we have found is that the parents who take the time to follow our framework, to prepare before eligibility meetings, to prepare before IEP meetings, to ask for data, to kind of do a lot on the front end before they actually walk into the school meetings, they see that it is absolutely worth the time, the energy, and the effort. And I say that because they're getting different results for their child, and their child is actually making meaningful progress. And you know, I can tell you firsthand, I watch this every single day, and it's amazing when all the pieces kind of come together like that. So that said, I don't want to be too much of a Pollyanna in this presentation. I do acknowledge that even when parents, you know, take the time and energy and have an appropriate plan in place, with their advocacy, it doesn't always work. And there are certain situations where we do encourage parents to get an advocate involved because for whatever reason, they, relationships are starting to fray, they're hitting roadblocks, they don't feel listened to, even if they've done everything that we've taught them or are suggesting that they do. And I've just listed a couple of the main reasons why I suggest a parent work with an advocate, but definitely if you know your child has a disability and you see firsthand the impact, the adverse impact that that disability is having on them, then, and you're being told over and over they're not eligible for any type of special education services or supports, that would be a time when I would say you definitely want to have a conversation with an advocate. Or perhaps, you do no longer feel heard. You've gone to these meetings, and we did an email not too long ago where we were talking about the drive-through IEP meeting because too many parents were telling us it feels like they were just clicking into these meetings and they were told we have 45 minutes for your meeting and clicking right out, and it was kind of like next. So if that's happening to you, definitely you should consider working with an advocate to ensure that all of your needs are heard and that the time is taken to look at all of the data and make data informed decision. In some cases, parents tell us, they've got complete school refusal. The child will not go to school, hates going to school. I shared the example of the little boy who unfortunately was starting to be flagged as a behavior problem and was kind of at risk of getting a disciplinary record in school when really his behavior wasn't the issue. It was a unsupported disability. Even though he had an IEP, the IEP really wasn't serving him. So his behavior was kind of a manifestation of an ineffective IEP. So that is also when behavior starts to come up, that's a time to talk with an advocate to make sure, is it really the child's behavior that needs to be addressed or something else going on? And then lastly, if your child is being repeatedly disciplined, if they are being suspended, expelled, they're starting to get a disciplinary record. When you have a child who has disabilities and they have an IEP, there's certain steps that school teams are supposed to be taking. One such step is a manifestation determination meeting, where they actually come together after a child demonstrates a certain behavior, and the school team decides, is this a manifestation of the disability, or is this really the child was doing something, just misbehaving and there needs to be corrective action for that. So all of these would be reasons that I would consider consulting with an advocate or even a special education attorney, depending upon how egregious the situation had become. So for those of you who have taken the time to join us, and I appreciate you hanging in to this point in the presentation, I want to say that, if this sounds like, yes, a lot of this rings true for me, and I really do need some help in either learning this framework or having someone do this on my behalf, I want to say that we do work with families at all stages of the special education process. Again, my practice is limited to serving students who have the specific learning disability of dyslexia. So that's not to say if they have ADHD or anxiety or some speech language concerns, we don't support them. But the common denominator is that all of the students that we work with either have dyslexia or their parents suspect that they have dyslexia. And if that is the case, we do offer two ways to serve families. We offer direct, hands-on, comprehensive advocacy services where we walk parents through and lead the way through every stage of the special education process. And then we also offer a group opportunity that we rolled out last fall. It's a group coaching program where we get into this framework week by week. So we take 6 weeks and we kind of help you create the action plan for your child. And we give you tools and templates and examples and make it super user-friendly and easy. And parents have told us that they absolutely loved the group coaching program, not just for the knowledge, but for the community and the support that they received. And we also, as part of our group coaching, we do live Q&A calls where parents can get feedback in real time. And that was definitely beneficial to so many who went through that experience. So again, I want to encourage you. If you have an issue, you can ask a question tonight, but if you're watching this on the replay, thank you for taking the time to do so. And I would be happy to talk with you if you have a child who has dyslexia or you suspect dyslexia. You can use this QR code here to schedule a complimentary call with me. And if you have a child who maybe you're like, well, that's great, but my child doesn't have dyslexia. I would encourage you to go to COPA, and that's the Council of Parent Advocates and Attorneys. COPA is the acronym, and they actually have a great provider directory for advocates, for attorneys, for just everything that you can think of in your geographical area by disability. So that would be another resource for parents who are looking maybe for some help and support. Here is my contact information. If anybody would like to visit our website, we also put out monthly blogs. We put out a lot of live webinars that are housed as resources. We have links to IDEA and other special organizations, and what I'm just going to call like-minded individuals who are all working together to serve students with disabilities. So, check out our website, use it. We put all that information up for parents. There's free downloads. There's the opportunity to schedule time to speak with us. There's information about upcoming events. So, and you can also subscribe to receive weekly emails, which parents tell us have been extremely helpful, because we know things are changing in special education every single day, and not everyone has the time or honestly the inclination to follow this as closely as we do. So on that, Lorraine, I just want to thank everybody and open it up if we have questions, and if we don't have questions, hopefully we've given parents a way to reach out and connect with us.